You know, one of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style is taking their distance personally. We assume their retreat means we did something wrong, that we weren't enough or worse, that we were too much. But here's the truth. Avoidants don't pull away because of you. They pull away because of what you represent. A real connection, emotional intimacy, and to someone who hasn't done the inner work, that can be terrifying. Let's get something straight. Avoidant individuals often crave connection just as deeply as anyone else. But the moment that connection starts to feel real, when it starts to tap into vulnerability, they panic. It's not logical, it's subconscious. It's a protective response wired into them by past experiences. Somewhere along the way, they learned that closeness equals danger, that depending on someone emotionally can hurt. So they build these internal walls, not to keep you out, but to protect themselves from the emotional discomfort they never learned how to manage. Now here's where it gets interesting and heartbreaking. The more authentic and emotionally present you are, the more likely you are to trigger their defense system. Because you're not playing a surface-level game, you're not in it for ego or validation. You're offering something deep, steady, real. And ironically, that's the very thing their nervous system isn't equipped to handle. You think you're loving them well, and you are, but their system interprets it as overwhelming. So they back off, they disappear, they ghost, and you're left wondering what went wrong. But the reality is, your emotional depth wasn't the problem. It was the mirror. You reflected back something they weren't ready to face. You showed them a version of love they hadn't experienced, safe, consistent, open. And that terrified them, because when someone sees that kind of love, it forces them to reckon with their own emotional limitations. It reveals the gaps in their self-worth. It challenges the narrative they've built to keep themselves emotionally safe. That's why avoidants often come back, but only after distance has given them space to process what happened. And here's the kicker. It's often the exact depth of the connection they once ran from that becomes the thing they can't stop thinking about. Because once you're gone, really gone, they start to feel the absence of what they couldn't name while you were there. That emotional safety, that grace, that presence, it wasn't ordinary. It wasn't something they can replicate easily. And when the noise quiets, when the distractions fade, that realization starts to creep in. Philosophically, this runs deep. Because human beings are wired for connection, even those who run from it. We all have an innate drive toward wholeness, toward truth. And when an avoidant loses someone who saw them clearly and accepted them anyway, that loss lingers. It echoes, it doesn't just disappear into the past. It starts to haunt them in quiet moments, in the silence between texts, in the late night scrolls, in the relationships that lack depth but are easier to control. Eventually, they begin to realize, that person saw me, and I pushed them away. But here's the most important part. The avoidance journey isn't your responsibility. Their healing isn't your job. You cannot love someone into emotional availability. You can't contort yourself into something safer just to make them stay. Because if you do, you betray the very essence of what made you powerful in the first place, your capacity to love deeply without shrinking. So if you've been abandoned by someone avoidant, don't waste time internalizing their fear as your flaw. Their withdrawal wasn't a rejection of your worth. It was a reflection of their limits. And ironically, the stronger and more grounded you become in that truth, the more likely they are to return, not because you chased them, but because you didn't. Because you held your value when they couldn't hold space for it. And that strength is unforgettable. Let's talk about silence, because it's one of the most powerful forces in any relationship, especially when you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. When they back off, pull away, or disappear, your instinct might be to chase, to explain, to reach out just one more time to clarify how much you cared. And I get it, that's human. You're trying to reconnect something that felt real. But what you need to understand is this: your silence is not just absence. It's information, and more often than not, it's the only thing that actually gets through to someone who avoids intimacy. Avoidants tend to operate from a belief that closeness is a threat. When you're near, when you're emotionally available, they're often overwhelmed, not because they don't care, but because it pushes against every protective instinct they've built. So when you step back not to manipulate, but to protect your own energy, you shift the dynamic, and that shift matters. Because without your voice constantly filling the silence, they're left alone with something they're not used to facing, their own inner world. Here's the thing: avoidants often stay in control by creating emotional distance. When you stop running after them, they lose that control. And it's in that loss of control that the truth starts to rise to the surface. Suddenly, the quiet isn't peaceful for them. It's revealing, it echoes, and in that space, they begin to feel things they've spent years suppressing: regret, longing, and maybe even the beginnings of accountability. Psychologically, this is about nervous system regulation. In a relationship, avoidants are often in a state of low-level fight or flight. Emotional closeness triggers their defenses, but distance, ironically, can reduce that anxiety. And once their system starts to calm, they can finally begin to reflect on what actually happened. What you brought to the relationship, what they pushed away, and most importantly, why. The silence isn't just the absence of your presence, it becomes a mirror, and that mirror reflects back what they lost, what they took for granted, what they couldn't fully receive at the time. But it also reflects back who they were in the relationship, and for some, that realization is jarring. When they're no longer reacting to emotional closeness, they can begin to see how much of the conflict or distance was rooted in their own avoidance. And that, my friend, is the beginning of awareness. Now, don't get me wrong. This doesn't mean they'll always come back. And it definitely doesn't mean they've changed just because they reach out. But it does mean the silence served a purpose. It cracked open the part of them that connection alone couldn't reach. Because sometimes people need to lose something in order to truly understand its value. And not because they're cruel or careless, but because their internal systems are so deeply conditioned to reject what they actually want most. This is where the philosophical layer comes in. We are, at our core, meaning-making creatures. When someone disappears, our minds want closure. We want answers. We want a reason. But the deeper truth is that not hearing from someone often tells you everything you need to know. Their silence is their message, and your silence, that's your boundary. It's your clarity. It's your refusal to play a game of emotional hide and seek with someone who isn't yet ready to meet you where you are. There's something else I want to touch on here, and it's big. When avoidants finally realize what they had, it's usually because the emotional chaos has settled. They're no longer in the thick of fear. They've had time to reflect, and suddenly what you offered, your presence, your grace, your stability, feels like something rare. And let's be honest, it was rare, but they couldn't feel that while they were busy running from it. It's only in hindsight that the weight of your worth becomes clear to them. But by the time they realize it, you might be gone. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually, because silence doesn't just give them space to reflect. It gives you space to heal, to rebuild, to remember who you are without having to fight for someone to stay. And that's powerful. That's when the balance shifts, not because you played a game, but because you chose peace over pursuit, clarity over chaos. So if you're in the silence right now, if you've pulled back, if you're wondering whether it's being felt, trust that it is. Trust that the absence of your voice is saying more than your words ever could. Because the moment someone realizes what they've lost, it's usually when there's no longer noise covering it up. Let's be clear about something that most people don't want to hear, waiting around for an avoidant to come back will not make them value you more. Growth does. Evolution does. And not theirs, yours. When you stop obsessing over the timing of their return and start investing in your own healing, your energy shifts. And believe me, that shift is undeniable. It's what they feel before they ever send that "Hey, how have you been?" message. Because you're no longer showing up as the person who is willing to bend just to keep the connection alive. You're showing up as someone who no longer needs it to feel whole. See, here's what happens. When an avoidant ends things or starts to distance themselves, they do it believing you'll stay stuck. Emotionally, mentally, maybe even physically. That you'll remain in the same emotional posture, waiting, hoping, replaying the good times like a highlight reel. But when that doesn't happen, when they feel you've detached, when they sense that something in you has shifted, they notice. Even if they never say it, even if they never come back, that energy, your forward momentum, is felt. Because here's the truth. They weren't expecting you to heal. They were expecting you to hang on. But the reality is, it's in that healing, in that detachment, that you become magnetic again. Not in a performative way, not as some strategic move to win them back, but in the most real, grounded way possible. Because now, you're operating from self-respect. You've stopped trying to earn love. You've stopped needing their presence to validate your worth. And that, right there, is where your power lies. Psychologically, we know that the human brain is wired for patterns. When you've been in a dynamic where you overgive and they underrespond, that pattern becomes familiar, safe, even when it's painful. But when you interrupt that pattern with growth, when you start to show up differently, with boundaries, clarity, and confidence, you force a recalibration. Not just in them, but in you. And it's in that recalibration that the avoidant begins to feel something they rarely confront: loss. Not just of a person, but of a version of you that was always available, always waiting, always accommodating. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying growth should be used as a weapon or a strategy to lure someone back. If that's your motive, you're still trapped in the cycle. Real growth has no agenda. Real growth says, I love myself too much to keep chasing someone who doesn't know how to hold me. It says, I deserve peace, not emotional whiplash. And when you stand in that truth, people notice, even the ones who walked away. Philosophically, this is about self-possession. When you reclaim your identity outside of the relationship, you begin to embody something so many people search for but rarely find: wholeness. And ironically, that wholeness is what the avoidant was drawn to in the first place, but couldn't handle. Because your grounded presence triggered the parts of them they hadn't healed. But once you stop trying to fix or save or prove yourself to them, something extraordinary happens. You stop becoming a threat to their nervous system, and instead become a mirror to their unrealized potential. And that is exactly when many of them come back. Because now, the emotional charge is gone. The chaos is gone. All that's left is truth, and the version of you they couldn't fully receive when it was offered freely. But by the time they return, you've changed. You're no longer trying to win them. You're evaluating whether they still fit, whether they've grown too. Whether they've done the inner work necessary to meet you where you are now. And that's the power of your evolution. It doesn't just shift the dynamic, it redefines it entirely. So if you're in that place where you're wondering, will they come back? I want to challenge you to ask a better question. Who am I becoming while they're gone? Because the answer to that will shape your entire reality, whether they return or not.